Good afternoon. I'm Don Carter, co-chair of the Remaking Cities Congress. On behalf of the Remaking Cities Institute of Carnegie Mellon University and the American Institute of Architects, we welcome you to Pittsburgh and we welcome you to the 2013 Remaking Cities Congress. My co-chair is Joel Mills of the AIA. Our honorary chair is His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. Now, before we begin today's program, I want to issue a challenge to all of you. Let's begin today with the end in mind, the end of the Congress in mind. Our goal is to come out of this Congress on Friday with consensus propositions and recommendations for the future of post-industrial cities. The distinguished plenary speakers you'll hear today and those at the theme workshops tomorrow will be informative, provocative, and energizing. However, the success of the Congress will rest with you, the 340 delegates from both sides of the Atlantic. We were fortunate to have participating in this the Academy of Urbanism, the American Planning Association, the Brookings Institution, Congress for the New Urbanism, the Prince's Foundation for Building Community, Royal Institute of British Architects, the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, the Urban Land Institute, and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Thanks for them. We also would like to thank our benefactors whose generous support made the Congress possible. The Buell Foundation, Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation, Colcom Foundation, Ford Foundation, George Good Foundation, the Heinz Endowments, Hillman's Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, the Pittsburgh Foundation, Richard King Millen Foundation, and the Anonymous Foundation. Thanks to them. Now, before we begin our lunch program, you see there's an empty chair over here. I'm not Clint Eastwood, but I regret to announce that our speaker, Sean Donovan, had to cancel his appearance today because of government shutdown in Washington. He sends his sincere regrets. We also lost several other high-ranking federal officials from HUD and EPA and the Department of Transportation because of the shutdown. They're not permitted to travel. But we here, as organizers of this, we're all planners, and foreseeing no break in the impasse the last 2 weeks, we prepared a Plan B. 5 members of our program committee formed a plenary panel on the themes of the Thursday workshops to truly kickstart our work for the week. I'll call them up to the stage in a few minutes. So before I bring up the plenary panel, I would like to invite to the podium Ray Gindroz. Ray also attended in 1988 and will speak briefly about that first conference and his perspective 25 years later on post-industrial cities on both sides of the Atlantic. Ray is Emeritus Principal, a co-founder of Urban Design Associates. He's a graduate of Carnegie Mellon here. He taught urban design for many years at Yale. He was a Fulbright Scholar. He's a fellow of the AIA and a fellow of the Prince's Foundation for Building Communities. And for those of you from the AIA, he was chair of the AIA Design Committee, and those of you from Congress New Urbanism, he was chair of the Congress from New Urbanism. I give you my close friend and longtime business partner, Urban Design Associates, Ray Gindroz.
Thank you. David Lewis organized the first Remaking Cities Congress in large part to call attention to the Mon Valley mill towns, the neglected victims of the collapse of the steel industry. It was an unfashionable topic that few people or organizations outside the valley were willing to tackle. Now, there was some optimism in those days. We were just emerging from the time, from the long period in which urban was a 4-letter word. Remember that? And maybe the only time in history that the centers of our regions were not considered to be the most valuable parts of the region. There had been considerable attention paid to downtown, which was enjoying its second renaissance here in Pittsburgh. And interestingly enough, the universities were beginning to flex their research muscles sufficiently to launch the Pittsburgh Technology Park, which began this whole integration of university research and business development. But the towns in the Steel Valley seemed remote, and their plight overwhelmingly difficult to deal with. It was much easier to ignore them. David saw the potential in the solid but neglected building stock of pattern book houses, in the walkable form of the towns, which fully followed the principles that would be later articulated by the Congress for New Urbanisms as the principles of New Urbanism, and the abandoned but still partially extant infrastructure of rail service that tied these towns together, offering the promise and potential of perhaps a polycentric region. He also knew that this situation, which seemed so difficult to us, was not unlike other parts of the world, and there are professionals around the world who were dealing with the same issues, and he conceived the idea of bringing people from different disciplines and different countries together here in Pittsburgh. And so we had a number of participants, particularly from the UK. He also invited the Prince of Wales to be the co-chair of the event. This clearly brought international attention to this area that nobody else wanted to talk about. It's hard to imagine a greater contrast between the grittiness and sense of hopelessness in the valleys with the glamour of the future King of England arriving and visiting it. And over time, the spotlight that this event focused on this problem and this area gradually became translated into a change of attitude about investment. So investment began to be made both from the public sector and the private sector. A central theme was the engagement of citizens in this process, of bringing this international team together in dialogue with people who actually lived in the area and knew the problems and had aspirations for the area. The AIA and its RUDAT programs had for many years prior to this conducted charrettes in which specialists in different disciplines came together with citizens. In Britain, the RIBA was launching the Community Architecture Program, which was based on a similar idea. And the Prince of Wales was a champion of such processes, a champion of bottom-up processes. How ironic that a member of the royal family would be far more democratic than the architectural elite of his country. Now, popular movements had been well underway, but this program brought new momentum to it. And this engagement in the charrette process became a central tenet of New Urbanism and other movements that followed. It's now almost, but not quite, standard practice, and became central in such examples of even regional planning, such as Envision Utah and the revisioning of southern Louisiana after Katrina. So people often ask, well, what was the result of the first Congress? What was its most important product? And certainly there were some local successes. But I often think, as a veteran of many such events, that the most important product is the exchange of ideas among people of different disciplines, some of whom disagree with each other, but who share a common set of values and perhaps are meeting for the same time. And the format of the first Congress, which I must warn you is the same format for this one, is to not sit around and listen, but to actively engage in working sessions and discussions to become participants. In a way, the conversations that in most conferences happen in bars and hallways and lobbies are now actually happening in the working session. And these most important conversations, it seems to me, are a means of establishing a network. In this case, in the case of the first Congress, those relationships have lasted for a long time, witness the fact so many people have come back. The idea of intense engagement with community and an interdisciplinary approach was seen a few years later at HUD when the Hope 6 program changed the paradigm for how federal money was spent in communities. Instead of parachuting in a standard product, the funding was used to support a process that engaged citizens, the local power structure, the local business community, private developers, in finding ways of rebuilding communities in response to local needs. Same approach. A few years after the Remaking Cities Institute, many of us on this side of the Atlantic found ourselves magically transported to Yorkshire, England, at the invitation of Alan Simpson, a participant in the first Congress, to participate in a series of charrettes on projects that seemed very familiar to the Mon Valley. We were working side by side, in some cases, with people who were here. Now, John Thompson, who's sitting in one of the front rows over here, very prominent English architect, said frequently during those sessions, I hope he still believes it, that the experience of being here at the Remaking Cities Conference fundamentally changed his approach to practice and urban design. He later established the Academy of Urbanism to continue the tradition. Now, about the same time, the Prince of Wales established the Prince's Foundation for the Built Environment. It became an important international forum for these ideas, as well as an implementer of projects. Brought many specialists together, working on local issues, working with local people. Many of us from the US have been thrilled to work with that organization on a variety of projects in British cities and in other things, other efforts that resulted from this exchange, working on Hope 6-like programs in some of the most distressed social housing projects in Britain. And so it is clear that this combination of grassroots engagement and bringing together interdisciplinary skills is something that can be enormous benefit, both locally and internationally, and perhaps suggests a path for the future of the Remaking Cities organization and for other organizations, trying to bring this level of attention to be able to overcome what seems at the local level to be an unsolvable problem. And finally, one point that's from a memory, vivid memory I have of the first Congress. A group of local leaders, bankers, politicians, heads of the universities, heads of corporations, were gathered together in a prep session. I was privileged to be present at that meeting. Many of them had not met each other. They were all in charge of one aspect of the life of our region. Many of them had not met. And as the conversation went on for a little bit, the Chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh got up and said, you know, it's not really so important what we say to the Prince of Wales and what he hears, because after all, he'll only be here for a couple days. What's really important is that we hear what each other says, and that we listen to each other, and that we speak to each other, so that we can begin to work together to solve these difficult problems. Now, flash forward 25 years, we are celebrating the publication of a wonderful book by Bruce Katz and Jennifer Bradley called The Metropolitan Revolution. And he's suggesting that in the collapse of the reliability of the federal government, of which we have ample evidence today, that regions, metropolitan areas, are finding new solutions. And the book cites example after inspiring example of ways in which the leadership, just like that group being briefed in preparation for a meeting with the Prince of Wales, just like that group, have come together to identify what their strengths are, what the problems are to be solved, and finding new ways of moving forward. Now, we're now faced with a whole range of difficulties which seem quite overwhelmingly difficult. My wife and I recently moved to Norfolk, Virginia, which is a wonderful place, but of course we're not sure how long it's going to last because it's sinking and the tides are rising. So there's a big issue to be solved there, just as big an issue as the Mon Valley seemed in the past. And so this process of coming together to think about difficult issues and find creative solutions is the essence, in my mind, of this Congress. And I would urge you to think of these sessions as training for the kind of sessions that Bruce Katz and Jennifer Bradley have described as the solution for dealing with metropolitan issues. Thank you and good luck.